Well, this is the first of the series that the Centre for American Art runs as part of the Research Forum lecture series throughout the year. And I think over the course of the year we've got about 9 or 10 people coming to speak for the Centre for American Art. And I'm really delighted that the first of those is Professor Wendy Bellion, who's Sewell C. Biggs Chair in American Art History at the University of Delaware, where she teaches American art history and American and material culture studies. Professor Bellion's scholarship takes an interdisciplinary approach to American visual and material culture, focusing on the late colonial and early national United States and exploring American art within the cultural geographies of the British Atlantic world and early modern Americas. Her book, Citizen Spectator, Art, Illusion and Visual Perception in Early National America, in 2011, was awarded a Charles C. Eldridge Prize for Outstanding Scholarship by the Smithsonian American Art Museum. She's also co-editor of Objects in Motion, Art and Material Culture Across Colonial North America, and a special issue, which was a special issue of the journal Winterthur Portfolio. Her book, Iconoclasm in New York, Revolution to Reenactment, has just been published. I mean, literally, I've just seen a copy, thank you, today, literally days, yeah. Just been published by Penn State University Press. The book explores a history of material violence in revolutionary New York, tracing acts of political iconoclasm and the return of destroyed things in visual representations and civic performances. Her lecture today is drawn from the book and shares its title.
It does.
Wendy, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. It is such a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to many years of the Courtauld and the University of Delaware working together around scholarship and teaching in American art. So, real pleasure to be here. So, let me jump in. As David mentioned, my title of my talk is also the title of my book. But since I cannot talk about the entire book today, I am literally going to talk to you about parts. And parts of the book, but also parts of a statue. So in just about 2 weeks from today, a piece of Old England will go on sale in New England. On November 1st, a firm called Skinner Auctions, which is based in Boston, will include this very curious object among a sale of colonial American artifacts. And as you can see in the brief description here, and this is not the entire catalog, but just part of it, this is a cast lead arm and hand, a possible fragment from a sculpture of King George III that was destroyed in an act of iconoclasm in New York City during the outset of the American Revolution. Now, it looks terribly abraded because, as the text goes on to relate, it spent most of its life underground, buried in the garden soil of the homeowner who rediscovered it only in 1991. And it appears to have remained in private hands very, very recently. In fact, this was completely unknown to me until a colleague of mine sent me this last week. I had been working on a different talk for today, so it not only sent me into fits of excitement and hopeful desires that I myself would have $15,000 lying around to buy it, but it really led me to change what I wanted to talk about for today. Well, if that particular fragment is new to me, and I think it's fair to say much of the rest of the world, the basic outlines of the iconoclastic event to which it belongs are very familiar to scholars of American history. In 1770, British colonials in New York City, determined to show their gratitude for the king's support, commissioned a large equestrian statue of George III from the London workshop of a neoclassical sculptor named Joseph Wilton. You've probably seen a lot of Wilton's work around London. There's a lot of it in Westminster Abbey. The gilded lead monument went up on a pedestal at the tip of southern Manhattan in a park called Bowling Green, where it became the centerpiece of public rituals by British officials and the target of occasional vandalism by increasingly disgruntled colonials. Flash forward 6 years to 1776. by which time disgruntlement had escalated into full-blown rebellion. On July 9th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was read aloud to the citizens of New York. And that night, a crowd of soldiers and sailors came together in Bowling Green, where they pulled the statue from its pedestal, beheaded the figure, and hacked it into pieces. Most of the parts went to a town called Litchfield in Connecticut, where townspeople melted down the lead and recast it into bullets for the American Army. But some of the parts fell into the hands of British loyalists, who buried them in another Connecticut town called Wilton, absolutely no relationship to Joseph Wilton. Now, by any reckoning, the statue of the king should have stayed on and under the ground. Yet ever since the Revolution, George III has been writing back into American culture, rearing his gilded head in paintings and prints, some of which you see here, as well as civic pageants and parades. In the book from which I draw this talk, I argue that these visual and performative representations help to construct a powerful creation story about the United States, wherein iconoclasm figures as a parable of American nationhood. In New York, for example, the statue's destruction has become the city's version of the Boston Tea Party. It quite literally marks a tipping point from British colony to American statehood. Nationally, the story of the destruction has served a political narrative about liberty and independence. And in both popular and scholarly accounts, the statue's end has become synonymous with the idea of a national birthday. Down goes the king and his North American empire, and up go the American people to take his place. The emergence of this origin story owed much to the work of visual artists and historical reenactors, literally reenactors who came together to pull down or pretend to pull down papier-mâché models of this statue between the 1870s and the 1930s, when a series of colonial revivals aroused a nostalgic and deeply racialized Anglophilia among white elite Americans. Yet this creation story also owed something to the surviving fragments of the statue, which scattered far beyond the places where they were interred in the 18th century. Many of these fragments found their way back to New York, entering the collections of museums and historical societies. Some have been fetishized as historical relics and icons, in particular, the tail of the horse, which the New York Times named in 2012 as one of 50 memorable objects, literally 50 objects by which to remember the city's history. At least one fragment, recovered by a treasure hunter in the 1970s, became the centerpiece of a legal dispute over land rights and historic properties. And, as the example of the upcoming Skinner auction suggests, still others are now available for commodification, little bits of American history that can be sold to the highest bidder. So it's these objects that I would like to focus upon this afternoon. If you're at all familiar with histories of iconoclasm, you'll know that that destroyed things have a very curious way of not altogether disappearing. We might think of the busts of ancient Roman emperors damaged in instances of damnatio memoriae, portraits vandalized and sometimes scraped away, as you can see here, but never fully erased from view. Likewise, modern history gives us plenty of examples of objects that survive the assaults of vandals and return to public view, such as the deposed monuments to Soviet dictators that have been reinstalled in a Moscow park. And here you can see two of those sculptures at the far left and far right, interspersed with contemporary sculptures. And the forms of blasted statues of Saddam Hussein that have been remade into sculptures memorializing lost American soldiers. This last example has been the subject of fascinating work by Nausicaa El-Mekki. In the United States, it remains to be seen where many Confederate monuments will go, or if they remain in place, how they might be reinterpreted. So this example that you're looking at is from Baltimore, not too far from where I live, where the blank pedestal still marks a monument that was deinstalled in 2017. And as I'm sure many of you surely know, there's been much discussion about what to do with Confederate monuments in the States, with many people suggesting that such monuments simply go to museums, and museum curators understandably protesting that that raises a whole set of other problematic issues. Keeping in mind these broader contexts for the uncanny return of destroyed things, let me pose a question. How and why do the fragments of the George III statue matter, both for art history and for American culture, past and present? Joseph Kerner, who's written so compellingly about iconoclasm, especially for early modern European art, has suggested, and I quote, that most of the time people live in iconoclasm's aftermath, totemically preserving and neutralizing its gestures and settlements. In part, Kerner's observation is borne out by the efforts of 19th century Americans to recover, collect, and display fragments of the Bowling Green statue. On the other hand, however, there was nothing neutral about preserving these fragments. Indeed, the very fact that we have any fragments at all to talk about begs some deceptively straightforward questions. Why do people retain the parts of ruined things? Why do they so often conceal them through burial, a practice with deep human and cultural significance? What role do such objects play in the stories that we tell ourselves about history and iconoclasm? And how might the sheer materiality of fragments matter within those stories? There's complicated answers to each of those questions, but in my short time today, I want to suggest how the remains of the Bowling Green statue became the formative elements of an American mythology. Let me be clear, I don't want to claim something exceptional about American material violence. After all, people have repurposed the scraps of things for millennia. Rather, the afterlife of iconoclasm in New York allows us to see something peculiar and entirely overlooked in cultural histories of 19th century America, namely the enduring resonance of British monuments for an independent United States. In other words, New Yorkers managed to piece together their revolutionary past from the recovered parts of lost British statues. Their efforts compel us to recognize the material agency that objects command and sometimes even amplify after destruction. Let me begin by taking a giant step backward to colonial New York. The statue of George III was not the only British monument raised within the city, and in fact, it formed part of a geopolitical field of highly contested political objects. They included a series of 5 ship's masts, known as Liberty Poles, that were first raised in 1766 to celebrate the repeal of the Stamp Act, the first of the parliamentary taxes to excite widespread colonial protest. And what you're looking at here is an early 20th century image of what those Liberty Poles might have looked like. They were located at a space called the Commons, named for the idea of an English commons. And for those of you who are familiar with New York, this is very far downtown. It's in an area of what's called City Hall Park, and it is about 1 block east of the World Trade Center. So these 5 poles altogether went up and went down, were raised and destroyed, one after another, across about 10 years, from 1766 to 1776. A few blocks away, New Yorkers installed a marble statue of William Pitt the Elder, who was prime minister for much of the 1760s under George III. As you can see here, it's now missing its head and both of its arms. Originally, it appeared to be draped in a toga and carved in a pose that conjured up ancient Roman orators. Pitt was renowned for his oratorical skills. And again, if you know where New York City, if you know this part of New York, this is about 1 block east of the New York Stock Exchange, so a very prominent location today, and it stood right in the intersection of 2 streets, Wall Street and William Street. So So like the statue of George III, Pitt also came from the workshop of Joseph Wilton, and it came over in exactly the same ship, aptly named the Britannia. So both of these statues emerge in 1770 on the East River docks, and they're very shortly transported to the places where they're installed. So George III went up at Bowling Green, as I've mentioned, and this is also a place you've probably heard of, even if you've never been there, because it was the site where the Occupy Wall Street movement began in 2011. And then most recently, it's once again been the site of really prominent public sculpture, namely Kristen Visbal's sculpture, Fearless Girl. Has everybody seen this before, version of it? Which in a way that very much frustrated the sculptor of Charging Bull, was placed as if it's directly facing down Charging Bull. One of the really interesting things about this corner of New York City is that it has constantly been made and remade by the presence of public sculpture, really over a course of 200 years. So let me pause here and mention that there were absolutely no contemporary depictions of the Bowling Green statue. The image of the monument that you see here is also an early 20th century watercolor drawing. What seems to be clear, though, is that the statue was loosely modeled on a canonical Roman example, namely a monument to Marcus Aurelius on the Capitoline Hill, which had provided a model for equestrian statues of several Stuart and Hanoverian kings. As such, the Bowling Green statue may have looked something like one of these two images. On the right is an engraving that comes from a very loosely rendered drawing of a statue of George III by the same sculptor, Joseph Wilton, that went up here in London, in Berkeley Square, at the same time as the New York statue. On the left is a lead equestrian statue, originally gilded also, of William III by Wilton's contemporary, John Cheer. And as you can see, it's just south of here in Hampshire. I think, and I talk about this in my book project, that it was probably Cheer who actually executed the commission for the New York sculpture, probably working with piece molds that he might have had on hand in his studio. In New York City, colonial activists staged political meetings, parades, and clashes around the statues and the Liberty poles, animating the spaces and the streets in between. And then, in the opening salvos of the Revolutionary War, when British troops took New York City, all three monuments were partially or wholly destroyed in acts of iconoclasm. The King's statue was the first to go, in an attack catalyzed but not wholly caused by the reading of the Declaration. When crowds assembled in Bowling Green in 1776, they tore the figure of the king from its pedestal and decapitated it. They scratched gilding from its surface, and they drew the parts through the streets. The king's head was seized with the intention of mounting it upon a stake. Eventually, it was shipped back to London as proof that the rebels meant business. Witnesses detailed the gruesome pleasure of cannibalizing the so-called leaden majesty, expressing a sense of communal hunger for the metal, in part because it could be turned directly into ammunition. One man confided to his diary that he hoped, and I quote, that emanations from the leaden George will make deep impressions in the bodies of some of his red-coated and Tory subjects. Another delighted in the notion that the king's troops would have, quote, melted majesty fired at them. Iconoclasm of the sort that occurred at Bowling Green was a sure expression of political outrage. But at least in these quotations, it also seems to gratify the most material sort of cravings. After the statue came down, militiamen from a Connecticut unit ferried the parts from Manhattan to the port of Norwalk, Connecticut on Long Island Sound. So the lower circle that you see here is the very tip of Manhattan. The one on the upper right is Norwalk. They then moved northward up a post road through Wilton, Connecticut, and from there even further north to a military depot in Litchfield, where the lead was boiled down and molded into bullets. In Wilton, however, loyalists absconded with several large fragments that they buried in fields, near bogs, and even below cellar floors. The parts stayed underground until the mid-19th century, reappearing as farmers began to till their soil or to drain swamps for arable land. Accounts of these finds would remain a tantalizing part of local lore, fixing the town's place in a national story. As recently as 1976, during the National Bicentennial celebrations, an ephemeral reproduction of the royal statue was beheaded during the town's parade. It literally won a prize for the parade float of the day. In the immediate wake of iconoclasm, then, pieces of the statue, both large and small, spread far beyond Manhattan. They were conveyed to Western Connecticut, to New Jersey, and even back to London. In the hands of individuals with various political motives, these fragments would be moved, liquefied, recast, hidden, rediscovered, and recontextualized. Significant within these processes is a pattern of burial and resurrection, wherein parts of the statue disappear into various crucibles, into the earth, into a cauldron, the hold of a ship, even a sofa, and then re-emerge, being reformed or bearing marks of their travels. In the United States, these movements enabled social performances of American patriotism, but also British loyalism. In England, they were registered in prints that represented iconoclasm as a wayward means to political change. Above all, however, the post-revolutionary life of the statue was one of ritual remaking. Consider what happened when the parts arrived in Litchfield. At the site of the military depot, townspeople joined the family of the Connecticut governor, Oliver Wolcott, to melt down the lead and mold it into bullets for use by the American Army. This process transpired with an impressive degree of mythologizing. The governor himself luridly documented the material transformation of the statue's fragments, recording the names of all the people involved and counting precisely how many bullets each person made. And in case you're interested, it was a total of 42,088 bullets. A poet, albeit not a very good one, would later heroicize this patriotic labor in a verse that imagined, quote, His Majesty over the coals. And this comes from a periodical in 1835. So looking at the red box here, it reads in part, When heated to melting, he sinks in the mold. We'll hold him there still till new shapen and cold. Then off he shall go like a tale that is told in the voice of the thundering gun. So here, something very interesting happens. The mass of the lead figure appears to fall all over again. It hovers in place until it loses all illusion of figural sentience. These metaphors of declension and death recall the sorts of intentional confusions between living and metal bodies that would animate discussions of the Bowling Green statue both before and after its iconoclastic destruction. In rhetoric such as this, the statue's transfiguration also becomes a kind of transubstantiation, matter given new form, even sounds, and transmitted with conclusive drama from the barrel of a gun to a new destination. For all the interest that the statue's dissolution attracted, however, it's worth underscoring that melting down monuments to make other things was nothing new. The practice dated to antiquity. Moreover, the melting of the lead in Connecticut illuminates the continuity of British traditions and the very movement toward American independence. Objects representing or even associated with British royals had long been subject to attack and remaking. Following the execution of Charles I, to name one example, Parliament ordered the coronation crown to be melted. Statues of James I and Charles I were removed from buildings, and scepters removed from the hands of royal sculptors. A few decades later, in Newcastle, followers of the Protestant newcomer William III instigated the destruction of an equestrian statue that represented the deposed Catholic monarch, James II. After a rousing speech from an officer, a crowd decapitated the royal figure, dragged it through the streets, and tossed it into a river. Both the horse and rider were later boiled down, and this time recast as church bells. And here in London, the lead figures that surrounded the idolatrous Cheapside cross were refashioned into bullets for Protestant, Puritan reformers. Within the context of the English Civil Wars, such transformations might have seemed divinely justified. Arguably, the melting of George III in the early United States realized a secular version of this British practice. In Lichfield, the bullet mold itself became a meaningful instrument by dint of its reiterative capacity to, quote, hold the king there, and to multiply the lead into something else. It enjoyed an even longer afterlife as an object of veneration, when a descendant of one of the individuals reportedly present at Bowling Green preserved it in a manner evocative of a Christian reliquary. A man named Clinton Roosevelt, who was a grandson of a revolutionary colonel, Peter Curtenius, positioned the mold in the shape of crossbones and encased it atop a paper that bore a flourished dedication to his ancestor. This deliberate framing made the mold, which was, after all, just an unremarkable tool of blacksmithing, into a particular kind of relic, a functional thing adapted to serve a wholly representational purpose. The mold thereby made an argument for the family's role in a history that was ramping up to become a story of national origins, because it visualized and sacralized their connection to 1776. At the same time, by mounting the bullet mold in this particular formation, the Roosevelt family was participating in a passionate culture of relics. Teresa Barnett has underscored the manifold agency of relics in the 19th century United States. While relics operated in part as representations of the past, they also functioned as so-called association objects, valued for their connection to notable people, places, and events. More emphatically, as Barnett writes, and I quote, "They worked to do things that could be done no other way." In other words, relics materialized the past within the present. They seemed to exercise a transcendent, near magical quality, for they had touched and still embodied something otherwise only imaginable. Relics thereby triggered powerful affects in their handlers and beholders, arousing emotions that ranged from melancholy to reverence. Only the head of the Bowling Green statue survived in recognizable form, and the determination to save it underscores the evocative power of figural sculpture. This is not that head. This is a contemporary marble bust, also created by the same sculptor, Joseph Wilton. It was sent to Montreal, and it too was subject to an iconoclastic attack. It spent much of its life after it was thrown by American soldiers down a well, where it was recovered sometime in the 19th century. So now it's a part of the McCord Museum in Canada. So I think this is probably the best approximation of what Wilton might have modeled the head of George III to look like for New York, and also the statue here in London. So what happened to the head? Well, according to a British officer who was present at Bowling Green, the crowd beheaded the figure, quote, cut the nose off, clipped the laurels that were wreathed round his head, and drove a musket ball part of the way through the king's head, and otherwise disfigured it, unquote. This violent attack represented a sidelong assault on both the body of the monarch and the office of monarchy. The determined clipping of the laurel wreath is especially noteworthy, for it targeted the iconography that visually linked the authority of George III to a long line of rulers dating back to ancient Rome. American soldiers attempted to disgrace the king even further. They planned to impale the head on a spike, thereby evoking the macabre punishment historically inflicted on the bodies of traitors in Britain. While these actions implicitly struck at the authority of kingship, consistent with the objectives of declaring independence, they simultaneously reproduce patterns of corporeal debasement that had been part of religious and political iconoclasm for centuries. Acting through agents, the British officer intervened. He arranged for the head to be stolen and buried, and once it was disinterred, he shipped it overseas with the wife of a British general, a woman named Lady Margaret Gage. The officer anticipated that the example of the mutilated head would, quote, convince them at home of the infamous disposition of the ungrateful people of this distressed country. Ironically, Joseph Wilton could have been among the first to take note of the return of the king's head. When the Gages returned to London with the bust, they purchased a home at Portland Place, a few blocks away from Wilton's home and studio in Marylebone. In London, things really got interesting. Those entrusted with the royal head protectively concealed it from view. The Gages conveyed it to a man named Lord Townshend, a powerful member of Parliament. Thomas Hutchinson, a Massachusetts governor who had fled to England in exile, penned the only known report of the statue's head in London. During a social call in 1777, Lady Townshend asked if Hutchinson, and I quote in part from the letter on the left, had a mind to see an instance of American loyalty, and going to the sofa, uncovered a large gilt head which at once appeared to be that of the king. And I just love that image of, the Lady Townshend opening up the sofa or reaching underneath and pulling out the head of the king. The nose is wounded and defaced, but the gilding remains fair, and as it was well executed, it retains a striking likeness. Now, understandably, the Townsends shared their worrisome treasure very selectively, but rumors of the head may have leaked beyond their residence, because British printmakers soon began to issue etchings that posited attacks on British sculptures. These images reference the Bowling Green statue with varying degrees of directness, and they also address a wide range of concerns, from rebellious colonials to ministerial conspirators to British radicals. James Gilray, for one, pictured a group of parliamentary ministers assailing an allegorical figure of Britannia in this print from 1782. So at the base of this figure, you see a fox, which is a symbol for Charles James Fox, who was a leader of the opposition party. So here he is chewing away at the statue's one remaining foot. But what's also very interesting is what's happening on the far left of this image, where we see a Native American figure representing North America or the colonies, who appears to be making off with the head. Gilray produced another spin on sculptural decapitation in 1783. It's a satirical etching that features a bust curiously similar to Hutchinson's description. The artist now couples Charles James Fox, now an equestrian figure, with intimations of iconoclasm and political mayhem. Fox appears riding a white horse, signifying the House of Hanover, and galloping inauspiciously into a valley called the Valley of Annihilation. Behind him, in a basket ominously labeled Hopes and Expectations, appears a crown speared by a sword and a bust of George III, adorned with laurels and fixed upon a rod. There are several impressions of this print in British museums. This is the one that works especially well for my argument, since it pictures a gilded head, thereby evoking the statue at Bowling Green and the fragment that had already been returned to London. A decade later, in the thick of the French Revolution, another printmaker also invoked the threat of a royal beheading. Significantly, the image indirectly referenced the destruction of the Bowling Green monument, because it imagined the Berkeley Square figure of George III as the potential target of revolutionary violence. Etched by James Sayer in 1794, the image brings the London statue to life, Pygmalion-like, to suggest the fears aroused in England by the terror in Paris. So in this image, we see Wilton's statue, which appears to have trotted away from its pedestal to investigate a political gathering at Lansdowne House. This was the dwelling of William Petty, who was a prominent politician and aristocrat. As Prime Minister, Lansdowne had negotiated an end to the American Revolution. But during the 1790s, he supported Republican causes in France, for which he was castigated in the British press. Lansdowne's revolutionary politics, in other words, were enough to make a royal statue shiver with dread. Peering through a spyglass, the king appears startled to see figures sporting tricorn hats with black French rosettes. Just as alarming, he hears the chant of the French revolutionary anthem, Ça ira. His left hand flies up in alarm. Louis XVI had just lost his head to the guillotine, and Sayer's print, executed in a climate of unease about French Jacobinism, seems to intimate that George III could be next. From the accounts of the statue's head to these images, we see an elision between living subject and inanimate thing that will probably be familiar to anyone who has worked with rhetorics of sculptural figuration. Defaced metal comes to stand in for flesh and blood wounds. Scratched gilding conjures up bodily scarring. A bust in a basket implies a fate that could greet a real king. These are just some of the ways that fragments of the Bowling Green statue could be made to signify in the years after it was destroyed in New York. Over time, back in Connecticut, the Wilton fragments came to serve an altogether different story, one about loyalist devotion to George III. This history turned almost entirely upon the excited press of 19th and early 20th century journalists who chronicled the rediscovery of the statue in parts. Two aspects of these accounts are especially noteworthy. They describe remains of the statue purposely concealed underground, and they charge loyalists, sometimes in very sensational terms, with the theft of the lead and its so-called pious burial. Although such reports contributed to an inflated mythology about loyalist guile, most of the parts were in fact unearthed near properties that had been owned by loyalist families. Between the 1820s and 1850s, Wilton residents excavated more than a half-dozen pieces of gilded lead, including parts described as an arm and a leg of the king, a portion of his cloak and possibly his scepter, and fragments of the horse's tail, mane, foreleg, and saddle. Some of these fragments remained in private hands, but the largest cache returned to New York. In 1878, members of the New York Historical Society paid $5 each to help purchase 4 large pieces. And there's some of the pieces that you see here, including the largest of them, which is the one on the lower right. One of those pieces was the horse's tail, the object canonized by the New York Times in 2012 as one of 50 objects that, quote, embody the narrative of New York. Until a very recent reinstallation of the museum's galleries, the tail figured prominently on the wall of a ground floor gallery that told the history of New York City. This was a slightly illegal photograph I took a few years ago. Not only do you see the tail, but you see the headless statue of William Pitt, and in between them, a painting I'll talk about in just a few minutes by an immigrant German artist named Johannes Adam Ortel, which represented the very first painting to return to this history. It was done in the 1850s. So even here in this teeny little corner of this gallery of the New York Historical Society, we have a really important story of iconoclasm that's unfolding through objects made in various media. Beyond New York City, other pieces have been pressed into the service of national storytelling. In 2017, a brand new museum opened up in Philadelphia called the Museum of the American Revolution. It featured Sizable fragments of the statue in an installation that was called the Road to Independence. Notably, these pieces appeared embedded within the cavity of a mock marble pedestal. Above that pedestal towers a recreation of the lost statue, together with a wax figure urging on a new generation of potential iconoclasts. Everything about this installation is pretty wild. So this recreation was done by a Brooklyn studio just a couple of years ago. You would think that wax figures had gone out of style. They have not. And this figure in particular is meant to represent one of the sailors who was present at Bowling Green. So you can imagine my reaction. I was at the tail end of writing my book when this museum opened and sent me into whole new sorts of conniption fits. Well, together, the persistence of these fragments into the present day and their prominent inclusion in museum galleries should lead us to wonder not just why people destroy things, which is the obvious question posed by iconoclasm, but also why people keep the parts of the things that they destroy. More to the point, why were the parts of the statue preserved through burial, a practice with deep human and cultural significance? It would be easy to dismiss these acts of interment as mere expedients. How better to conceal a theft or one's loyalism or even potential ammunition than to locate the lead in the ground where no one could readily see it. Within the material culture of destruction, however, burial has complex meanings. In late medieval Europe, as Amy Powell has argued, paintings representing the descent from the cross presume the disappearance of the body of Christ, a potentially idolatrous image. The process of burying the surrogate parts of the British monarch was equally resonant in a revolutionary culture where both rebel and loyalist affects ran strong. Had American soldiers been the one to commit the fragments to the earth, then we might understand their actions as a further degradation of their former king. But it was loyalists who buried the pieces. And like the British officer who concealed the king's head to save it from the further humiliation of impalement, or like the Townsends keeping it quiet beneath their sofa, maybe to spare themselves any association with mock regicide, loyalists buried the fragments with a respectful deliberation due to real human bodies. Protecting the corporeal tokens of the king's form, maybe they hoped they could somehow preserve British America. Whatever their motives, their actions recall those of 17th century British people who held on to statues and busts associated with the deposed Charles I, burying them until the monarchy could be restored. And you have a wonderful example of this right down the street, Hubert-Le-Sueur's equestrian statue of Charles I, which has stood in Charing Cross since the late 17th century. It didn't always occupy this location, and when Cromwell came to power, the statue was removed. Somebody promised to destroy it, and they did not. Instead, it was hidden away, and when Charles II took the throne in 1660s, do I have that right? 1680s? It was triumphantly, the statue was triumphantly revealed again and was placed upon this pedestal in Charing Cross, where it's been ever since. Interestingly enough, Joseph Wilton had a view of this statue from his studio right up the road from Charing Cross. Now, I realize it might sound like I've been developing a very belabored metaphor of sculptural resurrection, but in fact, throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, Americans repeatedly tried to return King George to his pedestal. Quite literally, there were proposals in the early 20th century in New York City to create new statues of George III and to put them back in Bowling Green. And that was met with counter proposals by groups who said, no, we should have a statue of iconoclasts tearing down the statue of George III. It all starts to get very, very circular. So let me just share a few examples of this, of ways that Americans tried to bring this statue back in different forms. In 1909, the Boston Globe encouraged readers to reassemble a scene of the equestrian statue coming down in Bowling Green. Now, this challenge was riddled with ironies. The puzzle required some destruction on the part of the illustrator, who had to fragment and disarrange his line drawing in order to create this jigsaw effect. It also invited some playful iconoclasm on the part of the reader, who was instructed to cut the pieces on the dotted lines to match them up. And once reunited, the image would picture a sculpture that was seen as already always coming down, a picture that was already in the process of being pulled down by iconoclasts. However trivial we might deem this exercise today, I think of it as one case among many of Americans trying to put Humpty Dumpty together once again. Where the newspaper's readers may have struggled to piece the statue back together, painters and printmakers succeeded. In the 1850s, an immigrant German named Johannes Ertel created the first painting representing Bowling Green. And how a recent German immigrant, a 48er who himself was escaping revolution in the Prussian states, came to paint this picture of American iconoclasm is a completely separate story in itself. That painting was quickly reproduced as the engraving that you see here, a very large and very well-done engraving that circulated widely and shaped how the statue's destruction would be represented for generations to come. Together, these images and their many reproductions would help to propel the act of revolutionary iconoclasm in New York into a story about national origins. And because this part of my project expands well beyond the parameters of my talk here, let me simply gloss the ways in which these particular images continue to exert currency in American visual and political culture. 2 years ago, in 2017, protesters in Durham, North Carolina, pulled down an early 20th century statue of a Confederate soldier. So that's the statue on the right, which raised a lot of questions when it was photographed and this image circulated because for reasons that were a bit inexplicable, the form of the statue appears to almost have collapsed rather than fallen over, collapsed in upon itself. Commentators about the Durham act of iconoclasm were very quick to reference the destruction of the Bowling Green statue. So, for example, Bree Newsom, a leader of the Black Lives Matter movement, wrote in the Washington Post, and I quote, "With the same spirit of those New Yorkers who toppled the statue of King George, recognizing that the people had the power and ability to rule themselves without a king, we should topple all monuments to the Confederacy." Now, the conjuring of that parallel produced a meme, which you see on the right-hand side, and then a related article analyzing the meme, such as our culture, right? At nearly the same time, and hundreds of miles to the north in New York, educators at the New York Historical Society enlisted Ertel's painting as part of a program designed to help prepare green card holders for the naturalization test. So this is still something I don't know a whole lot about, but what you see on the right-hand side here is a screenshot from the New York Historical Society's website, and it appears to suggest that Ertel's painting is actually used on the naturalization exam itself. And to help prepare people to take the exam, as you can see here, it says the painting above is used to illustrate 2 questions on the test. When do we celebrate Independence Day? And when was the Declaration of Independence adopted? Type details you notice to learn more about the painting and the episode it depicts. So I think this is fascinating. It's sort of a mini art historical lesson being used as part of the U.S. citizenship test. I think that if the people writing that test understood the origins of this story, or the origins of this painting, which I think in many ways are embedded in stories about German revolutions of the 1840s and not the American Revolution of the 1870s, they might think twice about whether they would want to use this particular example. Well, collectively, and in conclusion, this reiterative archive of images about iconoclasm suggests that George III never really left America, or rather that Americans never really left him behind. The Bowling Green statue endured in numerous pictures and also partially, materially, in the form of the fragments from Wilton. Inarguably, the best known of these is the horse's tail. Now, to be sure, it makes sense that this artifact should operate as a mnemonic trigger. It is a recognizable thing, and as such, it exerts a special kind of narrative power. In a sense, it has become the tail that wags the statue. Yet I remain fascinated by the ways this relic signifies in relation to the other hunks of lead that you see here, most of which reside upon museum shelves, rarely seeing the gallery light. These other remains are baffling things. Thick, heavy, misshapen, pocked, and scuffed. They're largely unreadable. Viewing and holding these fragments, I found myself caught between what I knew about their origin, namely their indexical connection to a historic act of iconoclasm, their cultural status as relics, and their sheer thingness, their opaque mass and evasive formlessness. Unlike the tail, these pieces cannot be made to speak. Instead, as the most obdurate, even illegible remains of the act of destruction that brought down the Bowling Green statue, they serve to trouble the many pictorial and performative representations that continue to locate iconoclasm as a national origin story. Thank you.